In the 1960s and 70s, in the heyday of the women's liberation movement in the US, when feminism was too tame a word, mainstream feminists in the US were social welfare feminists, which is most typical in Europe. They supported abortion rights, of course, equal pay for equal work, of course, but they also supported public child care and welfare. Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine are exemplars of this. But the movement declined. And at the same time that so many activists were moving into families and careers, American politics was moving to the right, into neoliberalism, and it took mainstream feminism with it. So instead of collective social provision, we hear about individual responsibility and self-sufficiency. Bill and Hillary Clinton's welfare reform, in quotes, exemplifies this change. And Gloria Steinem's support for Hillary Clinton, despite all that Clinton has done against the interests of the majority of women in the world, is a sad example of the right-wing evolution of mainstream feminism. But there's always been a more radical and anti-capitalist current in the US, whether we call ourselves Marxist or socialist or materialist feminists or some other name. Personally, though I'm a Marxist, I usually choose the word socialist feminist just because it's the most inclusive and it's least likely to be misunderstood, at least in the US. Now in Europe, with social democracy, social democratic parties so discredited, that might not be the case. As I define it, all socialist feminists see class as central to women's lives, but at the same time, none would reduce sex or race suppression to economic exploitation. Which word we choose to identify ourselves largely depends, I think, on the particular political context we're in and the debates in which we're involved, as well as how we understand these categories. So the same label may not mean the same analysis. I don't agree with all those calling themselves Marxist feminists. And different labels may not mean different analyses. As long as I try to figure out, am I an eco-feminist, for example? Anyway, so you have to look below the term to figure out what people are really thinking. Sometimes these different labels do signify different theoretical analyses of women's oppression and capitalism, as I'll discuss. But interestingly, those different theories need not entail different politics. What are called dual systems theories of women's oppression and capitalism were developed in the 1970s in response to the appalling sexism on much of the left, new left as well as old left, and to Marxist, in quote, theories which ignored or dismissed women's oppression. In the United States, Heidi Hartman referred to the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism, in which Marxism subsumed feminism. Anne Ferguson was an early dual systems theorist. Across the ocean, similar dual systems theories were developed, most notably by Christine Delphi. They accepted Marxist critique of capitalism, but contended that it must be supplemented and significantly revised in order to understand women's oppression. Now, it's easy to show that sexism and racism increase the rate of exploitation in Marxist sense, as women and racial minorities are typically paid less for the same work or confined to the lowest paid work. But dual systems theorists say this benefits male workers as well as capitalists and should be seen as a function of patriarchy as well as capitalism. And they have equivalent importance, capitalism and patriarchy. Notice that the oppression is part of the material base, if one likes to speak in those terms. Many feminist critics also charge that it was sexist of Marx to focus so exclusively on wage labor in capitalism and to ignore all the unpaid labor done by women in the home. Again, very material. Indeed, they find it particularly insulting that according to Marx's analysis, this labor is not productive labor, in quotes. Surely, they contend, much of this labor is absolutely necessary for the reproduction of the workforce, both biologically and in the sense of getting it to the factory or office door the next day. Hence, not only necessary for life in general, but for capitalism. Other feminist critics, like Christine Delphi, however, reject this focus on capitalism. Instead, they theorize a domestic mode of production alongside capitalism in which men exploit women's labor. I will address these 2 points in turn. It was not sexism nor an oversight, I contend, that led Marx to exclude household labor from his category of productive in capitalism. One word, productive in capitalism. Though, of course, it is productive in a general sense. The production of people is obviously essential in all times and places. Marx restricts the definition of productive labor as he does in order to, quote, express precisely the specific form of the labor on which the whole capitalist mode of production and capital itself is based, unquote. And hence, it's the key to understanding the essence of capitalism, which is not reformable in that respect. As Rosa Luxemburg said, from the standpoint of capital, quote, the dancer in a cafe who makes a profit for her employer with her legs is a productive working woman, while all the toil of the women and mothers of the proletariat within the 4 walls of the home is considered unproductive labor. This sounds crude and crazy, she went on, but it's an accurate expression of the crudeness and craziness of today's economic order, unquote. Note that it's in this capitalist sense. The labor of a male carpenter who works for the state is equally unproductive as the housewife. Though domestic labor does not produce surplus value, capitalism and the constraints it poses are still important for understanding its persistence. The more labor done in the home for free, the less capitalists have to pay labor, hence their desire to push it onto the individual family. This helps to explain why women in the United States were able to win legal equality, but why caretaking is still largely a private responsibility. But feminists rightly insist that men also benefit from women's unpaid labor in the home. Even if most men do not benefit from this gender system since it benefits capitalism, they certainly benefit in the short run. They have a shorter workday. And even though domestic labor does not produce surplus value, this does not mean that women are only oppressed in the home but not exploited. As Delphi points out, exploitation is a broader concept than the extraction of surplus value. Marx said this is simply the form that exploitation takes in capitalism. The unpaid surplus labor women have no choice but to do in the home is exploited labor. Now, whether it's husbands or men in general, or both capitalists and men who exploit domestic labor, is too complicated to resolve here. But I'm inclined to say there is no one answer to this question. Rather, it depends on the details of the family. In particular, just how much non-wage work women do, and whether or not this is on top of wage work, which most women in developed capitalist countries are doing. So I think that a theory of a domestic mode of production is less plausible today, if it ever was. But Marxists do not need to claim that capitalist class relations are the only important social relations, or indeed the only class relations that exist in capitalism. In fact, other modes of production, for example slavery, have often coexisted with capitalism, and hierarchies based on race, ethnicity, and nationality have thrived within capitalist societies. So even if the idea of a patriarchal mode of production, with men and women forming two classes, is not, as I've argued, the best way of illuminating sexism and capitalism, it's not inherently inconsistent with Marxism. What would require a significant revision of Marxism is the claim that these two systems are of equal explanatory weight for understanding our current system, its history, and its trajectory. While this can be further researched, the idea raises a number of thorny methodological questions regarding just how many systems we would need to explain the various forms of oppression, how and why they all relate, and the fundamental meaning of a system, all of which make me skeptical. And politically, it raises the possibility of eliminating one system, patriarchy, without ending capitalism. However, in the interests of time, I will not go through my objections. Hopefully they'll be printed online in a longer form. Instead of a multi-system model, which seems to me like simple pluralism, I think we need a model that gives primacy of explanation to capitalism, but, and I stress this, which is not reductive. There are different ways of doing this. Recall Engels' letters on historical materialism, where he clarifies that all he and Marx ever said was that the economic was ultimately decisive, or in the long run, etc. Such phrases help, but don't get us very far. Better, I think, is what's been called the framework model, based on Marx, in which explanation is contextualist rather than atomist. The idea is that different modes of production, like capitalism and feudalism, have structures which make possible different causal relations. Capitalism is then understood to be the context or framework within which other relations of oppression operate, with more or less salience in different times and places. So this gives capitalism a primacy in explanation, but doesn't rule out other causes. Rather, it helps to explain how and why other causes operate, both material and non-material causes. Thus, while capitalism did not create male dominance, it uses it. Capitalism's essential nature allows for male dominance to lessen in certain ways, look at us here, but sets obstacles to its complete eradication. In conclusion, I want to touch briefly on the political implications of this analysis, though I've found over the years that these abstract differences don't necessarily entail political differences, at least not the abstract difference between a multi-system model and a non-reductive one-system model. Moreover, the connection between theory and political strategy is not as direct as some writers seem to assume. For example, the claim that housework produces surplus value seemed to assume that if it did, housewives should be a central part of working-class struggle, but this doesn't follow. Consider guards in profit-making prisons who produce surplus value, but who would not, therefore, be an important focus of socialist strategy, I assume. So production of surplus value is not sufficient, nor is it necessary, as today's struggles of public employees demonstrate. Good socialist strategy depends on many factors which are not timeless. The framework model I've outlined would stress the need for coalitions between different groups who are up against the constraints of capitalism, but would go beyond coalitions attempting to integrate the issues. But the same is true of those who accept a multi-system model. So while Anne and Kathy and I agree on socialist feminist approach to political organizing, whether or not we agree on the abstract model. Socialist feminists are involved in all kinds of struggles, some explicitly gendered, others not. In all cases, it's the struggle of working class women that socialist feminists focus on, whether the struggles are on the job, in the community, wherever. These struggles around the world exemplify certain core principles of socialist feminism, as Johanna Brenner and I discussed in the Socialist Register of 2012. A core principle of socialist feminism is self-organization, that, in Eleanor Marx's words, women's emancipation must come from themselves. But at the same time, they can't do it alone, but only in coalition with others. So socialist feminists work to build inclusive movements connecting workplace and community, waged and unwaged work, workplace and, caring labor recognized as labor. An excellent model of labor community organizing is a recent work in Chicago, Illinois, of the Chicago Teachers Union, uniting the interests of teachers and parents. As a result, their strike was widely supported by parents and students. In some contexts, one sort of issue may predominate, in others, a different one. For example, women involved in the U.S. Black Lives Matter organized Black Women's Lives Matter because women had been left out of the picture. Recently, a group calling itself Labor for Black Lives Matter has begun to organize. The paradigmatic gendered struggle for legal abortion was won in the U.S. in 1973. But socialist feminists pressed to go beyond an individual right to choose. The concept of reproductive rights was developed in the late 1970s by socialist feminists with the prodding of women of color who wanted protection against sterilization abuse and social changes that would support their decision to have children: child care, maternity leave, welfare, decent medical care, housing, and education. This would seem obvious in countries with a strong social democratic tradition, but not in the U.S. And as you already know, we never won those gains. In contrast, environmental struggles do not seem gendered at all. What could be more universal than the need for clean air and water? But this doesn't mean it's not a women's issue, as women are half of the human race. Moreover, there's often some gender dimension, even if it's not explicit. The UN Population Fund says that women in developing countries are particularly impacted by climate change, directly because of the difficulty of meeting families' needs, and indirectly by the wars engendered by scarce resources. Women are often the leaders of grassroots environmental struggles, which socialist feminists strongly support, as they stress that the roots of the environmental crisis lie in capitalism's inherent drive to expand production. Whatever the issues, socialist feminists also pay attention to the structure and process of the groups in which they work. Differences of power and privilege along sex-gender lines are particularly intimate and subtle. One way to address the problem is to allow, or better yet, to encourage women's caucuses, whether in unions, social movements, or left groups. In Occupy Wall Street, despite all their focus on horizontal process, the idea of separate spaces for women and people of color met some resistance, which is sad. More than 100 years ago, Marx and Luxemburg supported organizing men and women both together and separately. Alexandra Kollontaj's work in the Bolshevik government, along with autonomous women's committees, led to historic gains for women, rolled back, of course, under Stalin, where no self-organization was permitted. In the U.S. today, there's a new openness to socialism, from Occupy to Black Lives Matter, to the Bernie Sanders campaign, to new labor organizing. We begin to see the possibility of a new radical left. A key strategic question for the emerging movement is whether the insights of socialist feminism will be brought into the center of its politics. Thank you.